Welcome to this tutorial on the introduction to UiPath Orchestrator. Up to this point, we've spent considerable amount of time going over the basic activities that are used when building an automation inside UiPath Studio. As we begin to move closer to our conversation discussing the ReFramework, it's extremely important that we begin discussing this notion and concept known as the UiPath Orchestrator. In its most generic or highest level views, the UiPath Orchestrator really is nothing more than the management council or management environment in which all of the automations are ultimately organized, managed. You say orchestrated, but when I say that, when you get into more of a true productional graded operation, it's where we schedule all the automations to automatically run and execute on a schedule their predetermined time. It's where all of the major components, that can be pulled in or out of our various automations exists. There's really a lot of that conversation that will lead to future conversations, but when it comes to the core development aspect of things, when we're dealing with Orchestrator, there's, especially as we're getting into ReFramework in more particular, there are some interconnectivity points between Studio and your automation that you're developing and Orchestrator that we need to specifically call out first before we dive into our conversation as it pertains to the ReFramework and how the ReFramework actually works as it pertains to a couple of these particular options. So with the community deployment of UiPath that we're currently using today, everybody has access and ability to access their own personal orchestrator, and that's what we're going to use in our demonstration today. In order to get there, simply point a web browser, as I've got on the screen, to cloud.uipath.com, and once you get to here, you're going to be prompted for your login that we've used previously. So whatever account you've set up for UiPath, make sure you specify that as your login. I want to go ahead and get myself logged in. If I can type in the correct password. Once you get successfully logged in, the way you're able to access your personal orchestrator, it should already be set up and running for you. You'll notice there's an icon down here called default tenant down here, orchestrator services default tenant in this case. Simply open up the default tenant. Go ahead and click the link here, and this will take you into your own personal orchestrator. You'll notice there is a lot here, depending on particularly whichever environment you may ultimately be accessing someday. This screen may look slightly different. This obviously is one of the newer versions. You may come across the older version of Orchestrator that's got a slightly different look and feel. Again, this is the community version here, but the same functionality, core functionality, is provided regardless of the version that you're currently running. Again, as we were talking about trying to step towards ReFramework, we want to get into specifically talking about two important aspects inside of Orchestrator. One, right here, it's simply called queues. And this is going to be an area in which we are going to begin talking about a dispatcher bot and a performer bot, which is starting to step towards this notion of ReFramework. How is work actually processed? This notion of a queue becomes the staging area in which records that need to be processed get loaded into by a dispatcher bot. And then on the opposite side, a performer bot is then engineered that's responsible for pulling items out of the queue. We'll actually do a little demonstration of working with queues here in just a moment, and kind of just a raw conceptual version to kind of get the idea of what's going on. So when we get into talking about ReFramework in that conversation, the notion of getting data in and out of a queue will make a bit more sense. So this is one area that we're going to spend a bit of time. The other topic that we're going to spend some time in this particular tutorial is talking about the assets. So this is really an idea of being able to store values on the orchestrator that you can subsequently bring back in your automation to obviously perform specific actions based on what those values might be. One of the probably most popular or commonly used aspects of the assets is the ability of storing username and password information or credential type information for any websites or systems that your application may need to log into from a secure perspective. So think systems that need username and passwords. The Orchestrator here within Assets has a credential store built into it that we're able to save username and password credentials in, and subsequently be able to get those values back out from your automation development perspective inside of Studio. So to get this kind of started, so we'll build a couple things here on Orchestrator. And then what we'll do is we'll bounce into Studio and put together a really simple little mocked up workflow so we can demonstrate how do we actually reference and get these items back out. So you kind of get a visual glimpse into how all this pieces itself together. And then again, when we get into our conversation in ReFramework, a lot of what we talk about today in this conversation will be easily, hopefully, connected back and forth between those two conversations. And obviously, we got some project work coming downstream that will actually be pulling in some of these capabilities, so it'll get even that much more hands-on and direct application type perspectives when we get into those projects. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start with working on our assets here. So go to the Assets tab. You notice in my view right now, I currently do not have any assets defined. I want to create two of them. I'm going to have one that's going to simply be a text type value, and that'll make some sense here in just a second. The other one I want to be able to demonstrate is the use of being able to pull credentials back out. So that idea of being able to put username and password information into an asset. So go ahead and hit the add button here in the top right corner. You'll notice there's a blue plus. When you click on the blue plus, this allows you to create a new asset. And this asset name here that we are getting ready to specify is actually going to be a value back in Studio that we're going to see in just a moment, that we're able to actually reference and get this value back out. So purely from a demonstration perspective, let's type in an asset name of hello world. And you'll notice this type over here, there's 4 different types of assets that you're able to store inside of an asset. Now, the one we're going to do right now is text, which obviously you think string when we're in Studio. Boolean, you're able to store true false type values. So the Boolean here, integer being able to store values. And we're going to come back here in a moment and talk about credential. This obviously is the username and password capabilities. So for hello world, simply say type of text. If you want, you could put a description in here. It's not necessarily required. In the case of the text, I simply want to put the word hello space world with an exclamation point. We're going to make Orchestrator say hello to us simply through this asset name of hello world. This could again be any value. It needs to be meaningful to your automation. What is it that we are ultimately trying to do? What type of value are we trying to retrieve? So this needs to be meaningful to your automation. This is going to be the value that then gets returned back from Orchestrator into our automation when we build it. Once we have this set, simply click create. While we're here, I want to go ahead and create our asset, and I want to be more specific with this one. We'll actually be able to reuse this particular asset later on when we get into some of our project work. So this is kind of an important step if we're going to go through the future project work as part of this overall training tutorial. So go ahead and click add again. We can add as many assets as needed here. This one here, recall, we're going to be working a lot with the Acme 1 webpage. So the Acme 1 underscore login is the asset name I want to use here. This is going to store the username and password for the Acme 1 website. So in this case, the type needs to become credential. You'll notice the screen changes slightly from what we had with text. Again, description, you're more than welcome to put in description here. This will only be referenced on Orchestrator, giving this asset name a bit more of a meaningful value. If you're ever, especially in a project that has many assets, it's an easy way to kind of verbally articulate what this particular asset's for or responsible for doing. You'll notice the credential store in this case talks about going into the Orchestrator database. So again, I talked about it's going to save all the details in a secure fashion, specifically inside of the Orchestrator database. The username needs to be the actual email account. So uipath@gmail.com is the one that I use. And the password needs to match the exact password that is used to authenticate into that web page. So in this case, the Acme One System One login page that we will be using down there. It's this Acme One web page right here. What is the username and password? So if you forget, simply pull this Acme website up, make sure you have the right username and password, because these are the two values. What I just typed in right there that got me to here, those need to become the values that you type in right here. If this password is incorrectly typed in or the username is incorrectly typed in, guess what? When our automation attempts to run, you will get a unsuccessful login. You'll get a username or access denied error on the UiPath site when we get there. So acme1_login as a credential, put your username and password in and hit create. You'll notice as we do these, it's prompting us with Acme One login. There's our credential. Notice the value, it's secured. We can't see it. We cannot get that password back out other than through special activities inside of Studio that will obviously transpose the secure encrypted password into human password as it actually types those passwords into the respective password box. So that's why you're seeing in credential store here. And again, this was our hello world asset we had a moment ago saying hello world. If we would have put a description in, they would have shown up right here. So with that in mind, how do we now reference these assets? We've loaded this information into Orchestrator, which is a web application that is particular, is specific to UiPath. How do we actually get these values back out? So that's where I want to bounce back to Studio. Let's create a new project here. I'm going to go ahead and keep mine as a process. We're not too terribly far away from moving down to working on the robotic enterprise framework. This is coming very soon. Obviously, a lot of what we're talking about is going to be baked and embedded into a lot of the work that we're going to see that's used as part of that overall template or framework. But again, today we're going to use the new project as a process. And let's simply call this one Orchestrator Demo. And make sure you're saving your projects in your folder that we've been saving all of our work to this point. And my description, let's say working with QUE, queues and assets. And Orchestrator. Go working with queues and assets and Orchestrator. So right now we're talking about assets. We'll use the same project when we start playing around with queues, is trying to demonstrate that capability as well. So working with queues and assets in Orchestrator, simply Orchestrator demo location path, and click create. We'll get to our same basic example here, being able to see our usual blank canvas. We're going to bring in a couple new activities. So it's all activity based is the big takeaway here. Notice we added some new content out on a website, specifically the Orchestrator. How do we then reference these values? So open up your main workflow. I want to bring in a new, let's see here. Let's do a get asset here. This is the activity that allows us to get assets back from Orchestrator. What I was thinking about doing, after you do this get asset, I want to bring in a new sequence here. I'm going to bring my asset into the sequence. The reason I'm doing this is when we get to talking about queues, I want to be able to do some easy work commenting some things out. I want to rename this sequence here, working with assets. Here we go. And again, I brought the get asset into working with assets, so hopefully your screen looks something like this. You'll notice this get asset, it's immediately prompting us, what is the asset name? And again, if we go back and look in our assets, it's specifically talking about this value here. I want to pick on the the other one in a minute. Obviously, credentials has a slightly different approach, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Right now, I just want to make the asset tell us hello world. So the asset name, notice I'm back in Orchestrator here. I copied out the actual name of the asset here. If I go back to Studio and paste in this asset name here, notice this has to be in double quotes. It's expecting a string here. This is going to tell Orchestrator, go grab the value that's associated with hello world. So in this case, we told it the value being hello world. The way this value comes back to us in Orchestrator or in Studio is through this asset value. What's the value that has come back? This needs to be returned to us in a variable. So anytime we have a new variable, do a Control K. I want to call this one str returned asset value. Again, this is very generic in this case. You would want this to be a variable that has meaning and value by name as it pertains to the work that you're specifically doing in your respective automation. And obviously, to see what's in the variable, I'm going to just simply bring a right line in immediately under the get asset and simply say returned asset is, and then in this case, my new value here, str returned asset value. Put a little space in here, there we go. Str returned asset value. This is simply going to get the value and display, in this case, hello world. So if I run my current file, I debug it here, you'll notice in my output window, it's going out to Orchestrator, and it's going to bring back the value hello world right there, return asset is. Again, all this is doing is it's telling me, look in Orchestrator, in our assets, find the asset that's named hello world. So it's very explicit. You get this value exactly right. In this case, hello world, and it comes back, returns to us the value that was saved. Again, hello world. And in this case, it comes into this variable returned asset value. And we simply display that right back to screen here. Just so you can see how this plays out. I can actually come in here and edit my asset. Maybe I didn't want to call this hello world anymore. I'm going to say hello world again. And simply hit update. Notice my asset value's changed. Go back to Studio. You'll notice hello world here. If I rerun my automation again, I have made no changes to Studio. I made my change over on the Orchestrator side, and you'll now notice hello world again has displayed. So that's how we get a text, or obviously that would have worked for any of our values right here. So notice it's of type string. With our other ones, we'd want to make sure that we are returning and holding the correct variable type. Obviously, we saw you could do Boolean and integer as well. The other activity that we need to look at, you'll notice I just simply have up here, get, in this case, assets. It's kind of goofy there. In this case, get credential is the other activity that we want to bring in. Notice this one's got a bit more capability. It's going to get the credential value from Orchestrator. This one we'll definitely be using down the road anytime we need to get our values back out, username and password values back out from Orchestrator. It's this particular activity, get credential. I want to bring this in right underneath my right line. You'll notice here there's a few additional properties that we have to specify here. Again, what's the asset name? Notice it doesn't have the nice pretty little window that we had here. We got to go over to the properties window. The asset name, it follows that same approach. Notice it's expecting a string. What is the asset name in Orchestrator? If we go back and look at Orchestrator, in this case, our credential is talking about Acme One login. So I want to copy this value here, again, in the credential store. Come back to here, my asset name, it's expecting strings, so that implies double quotes. Type in Acme One login here. That's now talking about getting that specific asset name. Notice output, it's going to return back to me two new results. What's the password that was saved in Orchestrator? Notice it says secure string here. it's not going to actually let us see the raw text of the password. It's going to be in an encrypted fashion, put into a specific variable type called secure string. Username, on the other hand, it's just simply going to bring back the username as text. It's going to be in a string form. So we need two variables here. We need to be able to hold the username and password that comes back to us. So similar to what we had to return the value. In this case, we put it in the asset value. Kind of similar approach. When we tell it what the asset name is, it's going to give us, instead of one value back, it's going to give us two, password and username. So do a Control K here. I want to simply say password. And on the other side, Control K and username, simply say username here and hit enter. Just so we can see this obviously working, we'll get into more of the raw details as to exactly how to use these in our future project work later on down the road. But just so you can see how this plays out, I want to bring in two right line activities right here so we can see each respective value. Obviously, the one's going to be obvious, the other one obviously not so much. So I'm going to say username is, in this case, username, and the other right line here being password is. And I know some of you are probably cringing. Why am I going to display the password? And we're going to see, obviously, it's already erring here a bit. It's because password is not a string, it is a secure string. The right line expects to see the value come in via a string, so I have to typecast that one to string here. So username is username, password is password.toString, because password is not of type string, and the right line is expecting everything to be in the form of a string or text. And if you think I'm crazy and would actually display my password to screen, then you would realize I would not intentionally do that. So you hopefully know, as I described, the password's encrypted, so I'm not actually going to display my password. But in this case, there is our results. There's my email address. That's the username that will be used for the Acme One web page. So it successfully pulled that result back. As I promised, the password is encrypted. It's in this secure string variable. Notice it will not let me see the actual password here. There is a specific activity that we'll discuss down the road that allows the password to be decrypted and securely typed into, even to where you can't directly access the value of the password, sending that data to whatever application you're ultimately trying to type a password result into, so you can ultimately get logged into that particular system. And that right there in a glimpse is how you work with assets inside of Orchestrator, being able to get the username and value back via get credential or just a straight asset using get asset. I do not want to lose my work here, but I obviously don't need to continuously display results here. So I'm going to temporarily disable this activity here. So this is why I wanted to put these in two different activities. I want to disable my working with assets here. And the reason I'm doing this is I want to change pages here a minute, going back to Orchestrator, and begin talking about this notion of a queue. Again, a queue starts dealing with this concept of working with ReFramework and having a dispatcher bot and a performer bot that we'll really get into heavily when we get into our ReFramework's conversation, as well as getting into our future project assignments down the road. So long story short, a queue is a holding place for work that's been identified that needs to be processed. So think any type of manual process that needs to be completed. When you do this as us as humans, what drives work that needs to be done? You're getting that data from some type of list or some type of source of information. Once you have that list or source of information, then you're able to methodically go through and process each and every one of those records. You're doing some type of manual work. That's why we're here having this conversation. We're getting ready to automate via UiPath whatever that task at hand might be. So this idea of dispatcher bot, it identifies work that needs to be processed. When it identifies that work that needs to be processed, we're going to load them into this concept known as a queue. Then on the flip side, we mentioned this idea of a performer bot. It's going to be that bot that's ultimately going to then go back into this queue, pull each of those items out one at a time, one by one, and then whatever that actual work that needs to be automated and manually, the old manual process that's going to be automated, it's the performer bot that actually then completes that actual task that needs to be automated. So with that said, how do we create a new queue? How can we kind of start this process? So the first thing I want to do, so we can do some demonstration going back to what I've got in Studio right now in my little sample project. It's similar to adding an asset. We come right into our queues tab, so make sure you're on the queues tab again. And you simply hit add a new queue. And you'll notice it asks, what is the queue going to be called? What is the queue's name? I want to start with one simply called test/demo. Really generic at this point, I know, but again, trying to just demonstrate a concept and a point here. Similar to what we had before, you can give a queue a name here, or excuse me, a description, so a bit more meaning or context to exactly what this queue does. I don't want to get bogged down in the details at this very moment talking about this concept of unique reference when we get into talking about adding items to queue in our future project work down the road. But we'll get into a bit more of a conversation around this notion here. But notice right now by default the unique reference is set to no. If we were to change this to yes and working with some of our attributes that we'll get into talking about inside of our actual project work down the road, you can actually set this unique reference value to yes, and this ultimately is tasked with making sure that we don't get duplicate records added to the queue accidentally. So think about running a dispatcher bot, as we talked about twice, back to back, it'll actually duplicate the records that go into a queue, but through the use of setting a unique reference, we'll have the ability to ensure that only, if, again, it's based on a per automation basis, if there is a specific need to ensure duplicate records don't get added to a queue, it's through this option here that we can do some additional work to ensure that duplicate records don't get added to a queue. And then this notion of auto retry and then the maximum number of retries down here, these are both associated. The ability that if we're getting into an exception state in part of our process, this allows Orchestrator the option and ability to attempt to reprocess the item that we're currently attempting to process in queue. Speaking obviously more towards our performer bot operations when we get into that aspect. So more to come on this obviously down the road when we get into really talking about the in-depth and specific details as it pertains to this notion of being able to retry. So for now, we're going to leave these alone. We'll leave the default set. The important part here is we create our queue is giving it a meaningful name that obviously we can then re-reference back on the studio and the actual automation side of things. So test/demo, leave the defaults here, simply hit add. And you'll notice it will come back here and we've got our queue at this point. So how can we begin working with this queue? So what we are going to do is kind of role play out this notion of having a dispatcher bot and a performer bot. We're doing a role play here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. When we get into talking about ReFramework in a bit more depth and detail, this whole notion will definitely have a lot more context associated to it. So what I'm going to do at the very bottom of my commented out activity here, I'm going to bring in another new sequence here. Again, just to be able to differentiate the two that I've got in here. In this case, I want to say working with queues at this point. Working with queues. Q-U-E-U-E-S. Working with queues. So what we'll see when if we peel our ReFramework back, as an onion, get all the way to the core of it, what you're ultimately going to just see is I shouldn't say you'll see it. You'll see it when we really deal with performer, but when we deal with dispatcher bot, we'll get into this notion of adding a queue item, getting an item added to the queue. And then, as I was talking about a moment ago, if we peeled the ReFramework all the way down, that's specific, we'd eventually find an activity in there called get transaction item, and we're going to do both of those right here and now. So our first one here, we got to get a data point into the queue first. So I'm going to do a add queue item activity here. If I bring this in, drop it in, I'm going to put this in my working with queues. You know what? I'm going to do this just so we can visually see this a bit more. I'm going to bring in a new sequence here and call this one dispatcher. This is what your dispatcher bot would eventually at some point contain. You would have an add queue item activity here. You'll notice in the add queue item, there are a lot of properties here. The one that I really want to call out first is the queue name here. This is exactly the value that we have right here. Similar to what we had with assets, what queue do you want to work with at this point? In this case, I want to work with the test/demo queue. So if I copy this out of Orchestrator directly onto my clipboard and bring this back into Studio, my queue name, notice it says as string, so this is going to be in double quotes. Now this add queue item, anything that I tell it to add will go directly into as a new item into this test/demo queue. So whatever your actual queue name is called goes here. The other important topic here to specifically mention is in the item information section here. Notice it says it's as a type of collection. If I hit these three little dots, a slightly different window pops up that we have not seen too much of before. And what this does, this is what actually allows us to add our respective values into the queue. And it's all done really using we'll call it a key and value type pair. So think the dictionary work that we did previously. It's the notion that you can add a key. In this case, I'm going to call it name, and feel free to follow along here. And I'm going to simply have the name John Doe called out. Notice this is a string. It has to be in quotes over here. And you can put as many values in here as you want. You could have just the one. I want to put address here, and we'll say, again, it's a string in quotes, 123 Main Street. Down here, I'll make this window a little bit bigger so we can see everything. Address. Notice the keys, though, do not get put in quotes. They're just plain text. In this case, we'll say somewhere is the city. You just continue to add values as needed. You know, in this case, it's going to be specific to your automation. What is this automation all about? So USA, obviously that's country, but we'll be generic here. Zip code. And again, string 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the zip code. So now we have data. We have a item that's ready to be added into our queue. This is the queue item here. As soon as you hit OK, you're like, where did it all go? Oh, no worries. All the data is still here. Obviously, in our automation, these all being hard-coded wouldn't necessarily make sense. You could put variables in here. So if we're inside this XAML file, you know, in this XAML file here, what variable names are available? So being able to reference variables as opposed to hard-coded values. Again, doing this purely from a demonstration perspective. When we get into our future projects down the road, we'll have a bit more context and detail as to how to properly load an item into the queue. And that right there, at its most fundamental level, those are the only critical things that we need in order to be able to get a item added to our queue. So to play around with this on the other side, obviously, if we were in a dispatcher bot, we'd be adding a lot of items. You know, this add queue items would be in some type of loop. And we're adding multiple items over and over to our queue. Notice in my list down here, there's this bulk add queue items. Notice here it's talking about being able to add items from a data table to a queue. So the status will be set to new. The idea here, you don't really have as much control over the items that are being added to the queue. It's simply going to take your data table and copy it into the queue directly across. Notice with add queue items, though, we've got a lot more detail in that. You know what? I'll spend a little bit of time talking about these before we conclude. But for now, I want to keep it simple. We've simply said specified our queue name, and we talked about our How do we actually, get the individual items into that queue item that's going to be added to the queue right here. So in order to see this play out, though, this is where obviously we'd be in some type of loop. We'd add all these records to the queue. The dispatcher bot would then cease to run. It would end. This is where we need to have another automation built. I want to bring in another sequence and bring it in underneath the working with queues. So right here, working with queues leads into here. No, I said that wrong. I want to bring this in right underneath the dispatcher, dispatcher into sequence here. I want this one to be my performer bot. So again, this would actually be in its own automation, obviously very generic single activity, but this would have all your logic for your dispatcher bot here. And then ultimately buried within that dispatcher bot, you're either going to have the add queue item here, potentially the bulk add of queue items, depending again on how you need to run your bot. Again, the add queue items giving you these extra properties that you have available to you and at your disposal. And I'll come back and talk about these here in just a moment. But to keep things simple again, performer bot, so you create another new automation on the other side. You will see in there, and this is not something that you'll have to do, obviously, as part of the ReFramework. This logic will already be there, but so you can visually get an idea of what this looks like. There's going to be an activity in there called get transaction item. So if I bring this into my performer bot little sequence here in this case, you'll notice the get transaction item, it needs a couple values as well. Again, what's the queue name? So similar to what we had in our add queue name up here, what was the queue name that we used? Again, this is the one back, if we look in the Orchestrator, there's the queue name right here. What queue are we working with at this point, our test/demo? So if I go back to Studio, the queue name again, if I hover over it, it's going to tell me it's a string. And if I paste in test-demo, that will ensure that this get transaction will go into this queue and it's going to retrieve one item. This is where, when I first started working in UiPath, I really struggled with this notion. It only brings back one item at a time. It's not bringing back the entire queue. Obviously, it's very implied here when you read it, get transaction item singular. So at this rate, I want to get that item back. Notice the output though, it wants to store that result somewhere. It needs to be able to, in a variable here, notice it says as type of queue item. So that's the data type. The data is going to come back to us in. So specifically all the data that we specified here, since we're in the same queue obviously, bring this data back to us in what's known as a queue item down here. So output transaction item, I can simply do a Control K. When we're in ReFramework, to kind of make it make more sense, you're going to see the ReFramework uses a variable type simply known as transaction item. So I'm going to follow along with their common approach here. Transaction item. Misspelled transaction here. Hang on. Transaction item. Here we go. And hit enter. So you notice my variables I should have, and I do, I've got my queue item type here. So now at this point, when this runs here, it's going to check and see, is there any data in the test/demo queue? If there is, load that single item, one item at a time, load it into transaction item. This implies, obviously, in our performer bot, this is going to have to be in some type of a loop, when we get into it, again, talking about ReFramework, this is obviously precursor type conversation to what we're going to see when we get into ReFramework. ReFramework actually has a built-in looping structure already defined for us that this get transaction item is contained within, and we'll get into those details in that conversation next. So obviously this is very transparent what's going on, since we're in the same application or same automation. You'll never see this. This makes absolutely no sense in practical use. This is purely from a demonstration point of view only. You'll notice we are adding an item to the queue and then we're immediately getting it right back out. This would be, again, dispatcher bot, one automation, performer bot, the second automation. Again, totally here for demonstration purposes only. And with that in mind, I actually want to set, I want to bring in this comment activity. This allows us to bring in comments here. What I want to do here is just have the ability to stop execution of demo between dispatcher and performer, in this case bots. In this case, it's really not bots, it would be sequence in this case. And this, to do that, I'm just going to toggle a breakpoint. So what I want to have happen as part of the demo when we actually run this thing is have it to where we can see the queue item added, that we can bounce back over to Orchestrator, see what's actually happened there, pause it as we see what's going on over there, then execute and then run our performer bot. But before we do this, obviously it would make a bit more sense to actually see the items coming back to us on this side. So to do that, let's bring in a series of write line activities. Underneath get transaction item, we need to bring back all of the data. And the way this is done, I'm just going to simply display the text. I'm not going to put any headers on here. You reference it as transaction item. And to get the item out of the queue item, you have to reference a concept here known as dot specific content. In this case, open parenthesis, what's the key? That's going back to what we were talking about in the queue item before. So in quotes of name, queue item comes back as an object, so I have to specify toString here. So this idea of specific content of name, if I peer into my collection again, recall I had a value up here of name as, in this case, John Doe. So what we'll see when the bot runs is John Doe's name should be printed out here. It's taken the item out of the queue. It's then displayed here in the right line, taking the name. So we need a handful more. We need address, city, state, and zip code to be more exact, so we can actually see all the values displayed here. So I want to simply copy this activity, paste it. So it was what, name, address, then was what, city, state. I'm doing this just so we can see the results. Notice, make sure everything matches from a case sensitivity perspective. I'm pretty sure the case matters in this case. Make sure you don't have any extra spaces or anything in here, like zip code. I notice I've got two words. I would not want to use zip space code. Zip code, it's got to be exactly what the value was, what our key was in our queue item when we added it. Another thing that I've seen issues in the past, make sure you don't have any extra spaces out at the end here. Same thing when you're adding the item, to the queue, make sure there's no extra spaces. Keep everything neat and tidy, no spaces at all on either side. So right here at this moment in time, we got the item that we just added. We're only adding a single item to queue. Our queue right now has no items. It's going to add one item and immediately get that one item back out. And then all these write lines are going to display each individual, specific, item that was added to the queue. That queue record, the queue item record, or we're calling a transaction item here. But one other small thing that we will never have to actually code, but so we can actually kind of clean up the process. There is a activity out there called set transaction status. This is, again, something that's already going to be built into the ReFramework. We don't have to do this. But so the bot actually kind of cleanly processes everything. I want to bring this set transaction status in here. This is what ensures and updates the status of the record. What's going on with the current record that was currently being processed. And you notice it's asking for that transaction item record here as a queue item. So in this case, it just simply needs that actual value right here. And you'll notice there are different types of results. In this case, the status is the record successful. Again, we don't have to get into these details. This is all going to be done for us as part of ReFramework, but this is how we can actually have the record show up as successful or failed inside the queue. And if it was a failed status, what type of an exception or problem has occurred as to why the record failed, so we can put some additional logic and detail on this particular record as to why it failed. Again, getting into probably way more depth and detail than is needed here. Again, more context of what we'll see when we get inside of our ReFramework. But again, want to make sure that the record gets successfully updated. So at this rate, if we run our automation, it's going to add the item to the queue that we just did. And it'll pause with our breakpoints. So set a breakpoint on this comment here. And then I'll eventually kick it back off and we'll see the output of our results. So just so we're aware, test dash demo queue here, or slash demo queue. Notice there are no items in the queue right now. There's nothing in the queue. That's what this number of remaining is talking about here. What's going on from a queue perspective? There's no data to be processed right now. We'll talk about some of these other values in just a second. So if I play my automation here, run my automation, debug my automation, notice I've got the top part commented out again. So the only code that's going to execute is getting down in our working with queues. Obviously, the only thing specific is going to be to add to queue. So if I run my file, run my automation, I should hit the breakpoint here. There's my breakpoint. So it should have at this point added the item to the queue right here. So if I bounce back over to my web browser, sometimes this page is a bit slow to load. Notice it's not showing me any items remaining in queue. So I'm actually going to click these dots here and say view transactions. And you'll notice I've got a new item in queue here. This is exactly what our bot has just done. And so you can actually see this. I'm going to go into view details here. And you'll notice this is the record. So this actually is the first time we'll see all the details. So there's exactly what I told it to add. Notice the key value pair idea. So the name, address, city on this side. Then this is how we get the values back out. So remember we talked about the idea of transaction item dot specific content. We specified the key. This is where we were actually going to see those names come back on this side. Notice history though, just so you can see this is exactly what we just did a minute ago. It just added that record to queue. So this is not something that's been sitting out here for a while. It just happened lifetime. So this gives you an idea of being able to kind of look back what was going on. What's the status of the record right now? Obviously it's brand new, which implies it needs to be processed. So that notion of being able to be processed, if we go back to Studio, and if I go ahead and continue to play, this is where it's going to get the transaction item. It'll run through all the right lines. And at the bottom, recall we're going ahead and leaving our status of successful. So we should see the new change to successful. And actually, before I do that, let me just, so we can see it, I'm going to toggle a breakpoint right before it does that, just so you can see that the status changes to in progress automatically. We didn't do any of that, but as it picks this up to get transaction item, it will set that status automatically to in progress for us by no action of our own. So I'm going to play, it will stop before it gets to the very end. So if I resume, it's now got my breakpoint set. Notice my output window. I've got my results, so all the data has been successfully retrieved from the transaction item. So again, your particular automation, what are you trying to do with these records? So from a performer bot point of view, what needs to happen to the data that's been pulled here? Again, bouncing back to Orchestrator, if I refresh this view here, notice it was new when we first were here last. If I refresh, you'll now see that that record is currently in progress. We're currently doing something with the data. You know, the bot's running right now. It's going through, it's processing all the details of this particular record, and then kind of role playing it back out on the other side. Once that record's done, and as a part of our ReFramework, again, no work of our own, this transaction status field will eventually get hit. So if I go ahead and hit play here, the automation ends, but this last little activity that we just did, set transaction status, look at what it's done on the back end side. If I hit the refresh button here, you'll notice the record has been marked successful. You also saw as part of this behavior here, we've got the ability to tag a record as failed, and you know, a type of failure. You know, at that rate, if it was marked as failed instead of being successful, that notation would be denoted here. So that in a huge glance is exactly how the overall process happens at this point. being able to get a record added to the queue, dispatcher bot. Like I said, not necessarily what you're seeing here. This is definitely not a real use case, just purely doing it from a demonstration standpoint. Your dispatcher bot adds the item to the queue, and then our performer bot on the other side retrieves the item from the queue, gives you the ability to process whatever that data might be. And then as part of ReFramework, that's where the status will then get updated to move on to the next record. So it would come back in again if it was in our ReFramework. Is there another record to be processed? Is there another item in queue? If so, go ahead and process it. But again, we don't have to build that logic. We'll learn in ReFramework. That's been done for us. A couple more advanced topics here. You heard me mention a little bit earlier this notion of the reference column. It's through here that through the orchestrator, if you turn that reference option on right here, whatever value goes in here becomes the unique value for each record. If you want to make sure you don't add any duplicate records, let's say, and this reference here, this is all going to be a variable, or obviously, if I want to make sure that there aren't multiple John Does added to the system, this value here, if John Doe was attempted to be added twice, we would get an error. We can't add John Doe twice. The important thing to note here with reference, though, if I do specify John Doe there, on the orchestrator side, if I come back to here, I don't think I can change it. Yeah, see, I can't change it. When I built my queue, the unique reference would have to be set to yes. In this case, I can add all the John Does I want, is fine, because the unique reference is set to no. So, and we could talk about this obviously later on down the road as well, but unique reference, if we set it to yes, whatever values get entered into here, it will actually then check all those values and prevent duplicate values from being added to the queue. And the one nice thing here, though, with our current setup that, at this rate we have not seen, is if I actually go into my queue and say view transactions, you notice that reference column shows up here. Notice it's blank. I did not specify a reference value in that last run, so this is blank. Setting a reference value at least allows this value to have data. It's populated. A couple other columns that you'll see in here: deadline, postponed. We've got priority as well. So these three columns here, those can also be set as a part of the adding an item to queue. So you'll notice deadline, postpone, and priority. What's cool with these three options, if you set these, notice we didn't set them here, they're not required, but if you do set them, deadline, if you hover over it, it's talking you right through the date before which the queue item should be processed. This is really trying to now put prioritization around the items that you add to a queue. So this idea of a deadline, you're trying to set, this item that we add to the queue, the data needs to be processed by X date. So role plan it out, let's say today's January 1st. Setting a date value of January 7th. The data that I put into this, particular queue item needs to be processed by January 7th. So what's going to happen is the bot pulls items out of the queue, I should say, as orchestrator pulls items out of the queue, as your performer bot's running. It's going to play into that factor that we need to make sure that certain records based on their dates, process something on January 5th before we process that one that I just mentioned on January 7th. So trying to put some prioritization around pulling items out of the queue based on their urgency around a specific date. Again, it's going to be specific to your individual automations. What are the actual needs that drive and warrant that type of behavior? Again, not required, but understand that option and capability is there. On the other side, if you don't set a deadline, you have the option to also postpone. So the idea of don't process this record until a certain date goes by. So leave the item in the queue until after a certain moment in time has passed. So notice these are both date time, so you can actually set them down to an actual date and time. So you can specify down to the minute or second of a day that you want to have an actual record processed or potentially delayed on the opposite side. Inside of this idea of prioritization, there's also this notion of priority, and you'll notice this shows up in the nature of high, normal, and low. Notice everything by default, if you don't specify anything and make any changes, will always be set at a normal priority level. the way this actually works in use case, or actual operational mode, it will look at dates first. And let's say we have two items with the exact same deadline, but one has a high, the other has a normal. Those two at the same exact deadline date, the high obviously goes before the normal, then obviously before the low. It'll look at dates first. Anything that doesn't have a date obviously is going to fall at the very end. Let's say you have kind of a hodgepodge. You've got some that have dates, and then you've got some that only have priority. The dates will always be looked at first, and then once all the dates have cleared, then it'll come in and look at priority. So then it'll do high, normal, and low at that rate. If you don't have any dates at all, obviously at that rate, anything tagged with a high goes first, normal second, then anything low would be done at the very end. So again, it's just all about setting these notions of prioritization. But with that said, the main introduction here is really, how do we work with assets? How do we work with queues? And then, as you saw inside of our automation, actually being able to see, a rough draft of what this ultimately looks like. The one thing that I want to do in conclusion here is obviously we're going to need a new queue for our future project work. So while we're here, let's go ahead and create a new queue. We'll simply call this one Acme 1, and we'll leave the default values here. We're not going to be too worried about the unique reference and making sure we don't have defaults. And same thing on the auto retry notion here. So leave your defaults here. Simply create a new queue called Acme 1, and we'll be able to re-reference this later on down the road when we get into our project work. So simply add that queue here. And if you want, you can do a little cleanup. You can delete the queue here. I'm going to go ahead and clean mine up. You can do that as well. The only queue that I need left here is Acme at this point. Same thing on the asset side. I'm going to go ahead and delete my hello world, but I want to leave this. We will reference this in future project work as well. So a little housekeeping, deleting my hello world there. And that concludes our demonstration and tutorial as it pertains to working inside of Orchestrator, and obviously that interconnectivity to Orchestrator as it pertains to working inside Studio.